Hello, history friends, and welcome to this live stream review of Unit 5 Revolutions, Political and Industrial. I'm going to start by putting a poll up so I can kind of see where people are at with this. I'm going to open the poll, might be down there at the bottom of the chat. And as you come on in, if you could just take a look and let me know how you are feeling in terms of your confidence in the revolutions, with one camel being, what's a revolution? Two camels being, I've heard of these revolutions. Three being, I could tell you something about it. And four camels indicating that you would like the mic. Okay, all right. I saw a little bit there. Yeah, it could be. There's a little bit of lag on this too. So come on in. Just let me know. That's down at the bottom. Confidence in revolutions. So there's a historian named Eric Hobsbawm who lived a very long and active academic life. I think he might have made it to year 100, recently passed away. And he referred to this as the dual revolution in terms of European history, which was his area, meaning that there was a revolution in economics and a revolution in politics. So a dual revolution. We kind of had both things. We're going to talk about both of those things today. So I just wanted to say hello and show you my Fiveable swag. Right. So I'm going to go ahead and share the slides though. Share screen, and I will also turn on the closed captions. Looks like people are coming in now. We got some votes though. People are voting, so that is good. I'm going to share screen here. I'm going to share just a tab this time. You can see there. Here we are. The voting is still live, right? Yeah, this is it's getting to be vintage now. This is fall of 2019. So pretty good stuff. Taking a look. I am going to turn on my captions here. Medium. Should be good. Got that going. Toggle captions, right? Very good. We'll see how this does with, it's always fun, the captioning with world history, because we have to say things like Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Not bad. You got that right, because it's not pronounced the same way in Haitian Creole as it would be in French, right? Toussaint Louverture. All right, I'm feeling it tonight. The Google has our back, kids. And I can see people have a moderate level of confidence here about the revolutions. So that is good to see. I know sometimes in a world history class, this is the content that when people get to it, they start to feel a little more secure, meaning some of the things in the earlier part of the class are less familiar. Kids have less context knowledge about them coming into the class. So. All right, here is our disclaimer. Heads up, y'all. If you want to take a look at this, the stream is being recorded and will wind up on the Fiveable site, and they publish videos through YouTube. If you ask a question, your name might appear on screen, so you can change your name. Looks like we have some old reliables here, which is great, by which I mean the usuals. Thank you, and some new youths. Welcome aboard. Follow us. Okay, I'm going to publish the results here of the poll. Kind of see. Coming in, so you can kind of see where people are, and I'll show you what we have coming up in the Fiveables. The Fiveable world here. So the next 2 Saturdays, this Saturday, Melissa will be back with imperialism and migration. I'll put a poll up at the end to see where people are at in terms of things you might like to hear about there. And then the following Saturday, I will be back with global conflicts. So that's World War I and World War II. Maybe I'll probably be tempted to talk a little bit about the Cold War. And of course, we have trivia events after each stream. And the conversation continues after this party with the after party in the Discord. So without further ado, let's take a peek. And I'll ask some poll questions within here to see what people are most interested in hearing about within this stream too. So you'll have some voice. And as always, feel free to ask questions. The very reliable and indefatigable Natalie is with us. And I'm happy to answer your questions as well, of course. So as usual, I will be starting with the big idea and then some power vocabulary, words that are used in the context of talking about these events. And then we'll look at context itself, which is really a little bit of a connection back to the previous units, but also things that were happening at the same time. And then, as I said, the concept of revolutions here is about a dual revolution of political changes and economic changes happening simultaneously and affecting each other. So you kind of want to think of it that way. Okay. There are two big ideas, two of the four key concepts from this time period in the AP World Curriculum are in Unit 5. These things would also affect the events in Unit 6. Although I would say that in this unit is a little less, the key concepts for the course are a little more specific, meaning this unit has these two and there's two others which are mostly in Unit 6, although of course things affect each other. So the big ideas here are industrial capitalism and the influence that it had, and then revolutions. And I've gone with industrial capitalism first and larger because it's the first key concept. And then Unit 6 is, the influence of effects of industrialization. And as I always say, do not worry if your class did not use the unit numbers. That can work just fine. By the same token, don't worry if your class did. It's just those are just shorthand ways that we can organize the material. So here's our keynote image to begin. So let's get the chat up hopping and see what kinds of things do you notice here in this image. What do people notice? I think maybe even one way to start this is to ask, what do you notice? And then also think, is this industrial? So what isn't? The middle is literally what it seems. That's the middle of the country. If you were to put a pin in the middle of England on a map. You see in there, right? So would you say that that is industrial? What you're noticing? What do you think is happening here? Well, it is not a factory, but I can see why you would think that. Yeah, energy production. More workers. Yeah, does more workers make it industrial? Some of these questions are a little deeper than they might seem. Technology. Yes, it is an entrance to a mine. Some of you might recognize this image. It has been on an AP. It has been used in AP questions. This is a coal mine, is what this is, and that's a steam engine in the background, but people are noticing some things. Now, if we take a look here, 80 years later, it's not the exact same place. Yeah, I think there are some pre-industrial elements here, Sophia. So if you see something that makes you think that, you might go ahead and notice it. But yeah, right? Because there's animals. There's still a lot of human and animal power here. Those people with the donkeys are taking, or mules, donkeys are taking the stuff off to be sold. Okay, let's take a look at this next picture here. So this next picture is not the exact same place, but it's the same region. So now what has changed, and also what has stayed the same? There are a lot of images of industrialization, so image questions. So this is one of the things we do in history is we look at continuities, we look at changes. You see, you look at this. Into the image, right? Yeah, there still are horses Yeah, that, so people are seeing some of the continuities, and one of those is that the transition from animal power to mineral power is gradual. We talk about this as an industrial revolution, but the two things exist together for a long time. It also does show the change. There's a lot more smoke here, right? It's a lot more smoke. This area, things have changed, and now this is, I don't know, they're not just mining the coal here, they're burning it for something, it would look like. Okay, so we can kind of see. So that's one of the things we notice, a lot of images. All right, here are, I'm going to put them all up at one time for us to look at. If we look at these four terms here, key up a poll here to see which one I should talk just a little bit more about. Okay. So if you look at the bottom of the chat there, I'll be brief about each one while people are voting. This is what does the term mean in general. We'll look at examples of them. But as a term, like if this was in a prompt, when I pick the power vocabulary words, they're words that are in the course and exam description, and they're the kind of words that show up in questions. You could also use them in your answers if you're writing an essay, but you're also possibly going to see them in the question. The most important words to know for a world history exam are words like this, because there's multiple possible examples for all of them, but you need to understand what the question is asking. Okay. So a revolution refers to a major change is what I have there. There's a lot of change, and whether or not something is revolutionary or not is the kind of thing that historians would debate, and you might have debated some things in your class. We just looked at and saw how the Industrial Revolution, there's a lot of change, but there's also still some things that's the same. But revolution implies that there is a whole lot of change. Nationalism is an idea that can be like the word patriotism in English, but it also here will have another kind of a meaning or related meaning, where the people, whoever the people are, should create a country. They should have a political unit, a state, creating the nation state. Okay. Industrial capitalism is getting a lot of votes. So if you would prefer one of the others, you should get your vote in. Otherwise, it's starting to run away. Or if you want to pile onto that, go ahead. I will share the votes here in a minute. So reform efforts then would mean attempts to change the situation or to try to improve something without there being a revolution. Sometimes reforming is an attempt to put off a revolution. All right, I'm going to show you the voting here. I think we have a pretty clear pattern in terms of what people would like to hear about. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and put that away. Yeah, I think, AT's got a good question in the chat here. What's the line between a revolution and reform efforts? I would say sometimes reform efforts could lead to a revolution because they might encourage people to want more change. And of course, I think there will be sort of a debatable point in the middle between reform and revolution, where you can be like, well, how much change is there needed to be a revolution? I would say a revolution usually implies that a fundamental system is changing in some way. Okay. A fundamental system is changing. So if you go from having a monarchy to an absolute monarchy, and then there's a constitutional monarchy or some kind of republic, like in politics, or if you go from a society that's based on agriculture to a society that's based on industry, that there's something systemic would be a word, something about connections between events that are going to be different, are going to be changing. But your question's a good one. That's why I pause on it for a moment, because it's really, something could be either. All right. So if you're going to write anything down, then you might write down industrial capitalism. So I'm going to start with the second word, which is capitalism. And because of the politics involved, this can be a difficult word to define. In a history class, what we're going to be looking at is Capitalism is a historian's description for an economic system. Okay, so it's not necessarily good or bad, it's just a description of a system. And capitalism is about, so capital is investment money. Investment in order to get profit. So that's based on private property, because whoever is investing in the capital goods would be looking to get to capital goods would be things that would bring more profit. So if you think of a factory, so industrial capitalism is investment is put into things like steam engines or spinning machines, and those things need to be paid for before any profits made. So that's why it requires capital, money to be raised, to be invested. You can think of industrial capitalism as something that's related to but different from the merchant-based capitalism that we would have seen in the previous. I would have talked about with the East India companies as an example of raising money in order to make more money by investing in things like bigger boats or buying insurance or buying provisions, hiring sailors, things like that. So industrial capitalism is the idea of raising capital in order to invest to profit from manufacturing things in mass quantities. Okay. I'm going to keep going through those ideas here. So let's take a look. I've got some things, and some of them, like this one, I took this picture. So why don't you just go ahead in the chat and see, what do you think you see here? This is literally, Locomotion number 1. Oh no, Locomotion. Yeah. Number 1, the first commercial locomotive, steam engine, and this thing went about 10 miles an hour, and I think it went about 10 miles between two cities in northeast England, and it carried coal from one place to the other. So which of these power vocabulary terms might this illustrate? Okay. And if so, kind of explain why. I think with this, there's going to be some there's more than one possibility, I would say. This is a very it was a very inefficient machine. Those things went up and down from the steam engine. So you had to invest in locomotion number 1, and that increased production, right? So that would make it a product of industrial capitalism. Although the machines that get invested in are going to get much bigger and much more complex as we come along. But some people might also consider this part of the Industrial Revolution. So if you're going with revolution, as you see this as a change, a big change in how things are transported, you could also see it as part of the industrial or transportation revolution. So I think there's probably 2 good answers here. These are ways you could do it. Okay, here's another picture. You might have seen one like this. This is a French cartoon from prior to the French Revolution, and the caption, or the title top, is translated on the right-hand side. It says Awakening of the Third Estate. So you have these 3 groups here. So what do you think you see here, and why? And who is frightened of the Third Estate? You have the awakening of the Third Estate has frightened some people. So this was from the time. Oh, sure, yeah. I think Gabby makes a good point here that, the French revolutionary government, some of the first things they did maybe would fit more into the world of reform. Then the revolution gets more radical and there's ups and downs. But yes, they are trying to change the social structure, right? So the Third Estate would be that. So I had revolution in mind when I made this. Yeah, there we are. We've got church and noble elites, the people who had previously held the power there, are frightened by this possible revolution. Yep, there you go. There's some good knowledge on the French Revolution coming out here in the chat, so good deal there. All right. Here is a topic that the AP test loves. So this is in Japan in 1875. This one, I don't. This would. There's multiple possibilities here. Mhm. The clergy would have been the first estate, so the highest in privilege, and the church would have owned a lot of land. The nobles would have been the richest estate. So it depends on how you think of it. So I think this we could see a few things. Yeah. So maybe give an explanation for what you think, because I'm realizing what I intended is probably not the most obvious thing, and that's just fine. Yeah, Marissa is tracking on my thoughts, which are that the Meiji Restoration and reforms led to Japanese industrialization. But if you look at this picture and you're like, there's a train that costs money. This is industrial capitalism. Like, you're not wrong. So that's okay. But I was thinking of the Meiji reforms. But I think you would see that, and you might also say, well, this is an industrial revolution, but it's a revolution in technology. And I do have a slide with that coming up with the Meiji on it. Here's another Japanese image from later. This topic really puts these units 5 and 6, this circa 1750 to circa 1900, really puts the circa in circa, meaning like around. Circa means around, that C dot. So really a lot of things, when you look at I know there was a practice DBQ that the College Board put out from this time period, different unit, last year, and all the documents were from the 1890s. Right, so really right at the end of the time period, into the early 1900s, there's a lot of continuities there. So in any case, what do we see here? So these are silk workers. We see those cocoons this young women are unrolling. But then in the back, we see some spinning machines. For that, let me see, what do you see here? Oh, that's not really what nationalism means, Caroline, but I mean, it is true that there is a national tradition at work here, and silk production would be the kind of thing that nationalists would use to make the claim for a unique, like, Japanese cultural or national identity. Right. Yeah, I think you could put this in the broad category of uh, the um, the Meiji reforms, that we could do that. So for categorizing, really what you need to be able to do, because I don't know, would be that if you see a word like this, that you're able to give examples of it. So that's why it's okay if you think of something as an example of it, as an example of more than one thing. That if you were to say that the Meiji reforms led to the mechanization of the Japanese silk industry, well, that's an example of it. Or if you were to look at that and see all these workers with the same job working for wages for somebody else as an aspect of industrial capitalism, but that's also good. So what you need to be able to do would be to take the words and then come up with examples for them. That's the key thing to go do. So I'm kind of doing it in reverse, giving the example and having you think of which sort of thing it could be as a way to kind of get those. Italy's dishing the good advice in the chat. Yes, it would, Gabby. And this was really, again, there's a lot of continuity there, in terms of, Japan had been producing and exporting silk for a long time. The fact that they limited that in terms of Europeans was they were still exporting silk for a long time. But this is the mechanization here is a difference. Okay. All right. So we're going to take a look at 3 elements of context for both of these kinds of revolutions. So what was happening that made these revolutions possible? And these are things that you should think of as um, things, developments that created the conditions where these revolutions happen. They're not necessarily straight up causes, because there's a lot of factors that go into them, different revolutions, but they are part of the kind of the groundwork. Okay. With Japan, I wanted to say something about that. Japan had been trading with the Dutch. They had controlled trading with the Dutch, and they'd also traded a lot with China. They were like right next to the world's largest economy and had a lot of commerce with China. But in terms of trading with people they didn't necessarily want to trade with, that's 1853 is the Commodore Perry mission. I think it's important, or can be useful, not to exaggerate how closed Japan was, because they were in contact like throughout this whole time. It's a little bit of an American-centered view. They weren't trading with us, so therefore they must have been isolationist. When in reality, when they're right next to China, trading with China. It's the world's largest economy. There's a lot of stuff moving in and out. But they did try to control their trade, and that became more open, if you want to think of open trade, after the 1850s. Okay. So colonial empires, so if you think of those Atlantic empires that existed, this growing productivity is about agriculture becoming more productive, and also the growth of what's called cottage industry, or proto-industrialization, or the sometimes called the putting out system if you study it in a European history context. And the Enlightenment. These are all things that are better thought of as context, creating conditions or contributing to how these revolutions happened, as opposed to straight up causes. So I'll take a quick look at each one. So colonial empires that we see here, this kind of shows the world in 1770, so at the beginning of our time period. You see the European empires in the Americas, and then the trade routes around the world. And the trade routes, I mean, if we were to vastly oversimplify what was happening in the world at this time, it's like American silver was buying Chinese and Indian goods. I mean, that's a vast oversimplification. These trade routes are bringing valuable commodities like silver and sugar, and the silver, at least, is eventually winding up in China to buy things like porcelain and silks and cotton textiles, spices, and things like that. So this is a context for the Industrial Revolution in 2 different ways, because the capital, the profits, the money will be invested in industries. A lot of that capital came from this Atlantic trade. The trafficking in humans, the slave trade, the production of sugar. One way to think of this is at the time of the American Revolution, the British colony of Jamaica produced more revenue for the British government than all 13 colonies that became the United States. All 13 of them put together produced less revenue than Jamaica because of sugar. It's kind of like how Kuwait or the United Arab Emirates today are countries that produce a really high amount of GDP per person because of oil. Here's the oil at that time. And then secondly, the colonists in these American colonies often were angry about the restrictions they faced. We talked about Japan restricting trade, while European countries under mercantilism, they restricted trade, or they limited trade, maybe not as much, but they limited trade with that the colonies could engage in. That's one of the reasons for the revolution. Of course, we're also going to talk about the Haitian Revolution. So this Atlantic economy and plantation agriculture is going to be part of that. And then finally, the ideas associated with the Enlightenment are going to move around the Atlantic world. So it's going to be a lot of the same words and phrases that are going to pop up in these different revolutions. Another thing that's happening leading up to this is the growing production of food and goods leading up to the industrial time. Yeah, So that was a general map. That's just like a snapshot of trade routes during this time. So mercantilism or mercantilism, I've heard it pronounced both ways, and now I go back and forth, would be a system where countries were trying to limit exports or limit imports into their country and encourage exports. They're trying to increase the merchant activity that benefited their own country. So the way that affected colonies is that people in colonies were often, in the Spanish colonies, there were things that couldn't be made in the colonies, or they were only made by, like let's give you an example, in Ecuador, and probably in Colombia and Venezuela, cigar making, taking tobacco and turning it into cigars, or also snuff, that was a royal monopoly. So only the king's or queen's factory could make these things. Other people couldn't get into the cigar making business if they wanted. So some colonists didn't like those restrictions. All right, so what does growing productivity have to do with these revolutions? Well, two or three things. In terms of the Industrial Revolution, the fact that agriculture was more productive, using things like American food crops. You see some American food crops here that provided more nutrition per acre. I'll bet you do. And then more complex crop rotation things had to those things increase the population, and that meant more workers available to do factory work, or to also more people to buy things. Okay. Yeah, the sugar plantations produced a lot of profit, and those profits provided the investment capital, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly, like by people would put the money in banks for the Industrial Revolution. So you want to think the profits from colonialism were invested in industrialism, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. That's way before. And the champa rice is more like for subsistence. It's not like a cash crop, a market economy, or a market commodity. Okay. The other thing that we see here in the left and right pictures are the increased production in traditional handmade goods. The family in the top right, linen, which comes from the stalk of a flax plant and is used woven into a soft but sturdy cloth. And in the top left, that is the traditional Japanese production center that would be a little like cottage industry, except it was like a workshop, and young women usually would go work there for the day, and then they would go back home and they'd be producing there. These things are important because they're, again, part of the accumulation of capital, the profits that could be invested later. There's an increasing production of goods during the 1700s by hand, traditional methods, but more people are making more goods and selling them as opposed to just making the things they need kind of throughout the 1700s. That's right, Hannah. So if you learn, there's sometimes it's called the second the second agricultural revolution in the 1700s in Northern Europe involves more intensive farming, like with 4 field systems, and instead of 3 or 2 field systems, and American food crops, the Columbian Exchange things. Right. And again, that's going to produce extra workers because each worker's making more food, because the agriculture is more intense. It's also going to create more profits that could be invested, or people are going to have more cash that they can use to buy things. Yeah. All right. So all that's going on. And then you might have learned about the Enlightenment as well. At least a couple of the practice exams the College Board has put out. They just love the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment refers to an intellectual movement it's a European phenomenon, but it's based on ideas. Some of the ideas are moving around from other places and then circulating in the Atlantic world. So we see more of the Enlightenment philosophers there. You wouldn't have to know all of the philosophers, and you might know some that aren't there. I picked Locke, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. Those are all good. You don't have to know all of them. Might be good to know a little something about one of them. And these are people who were philosophizing. But what they were doing is taking ideas from science, a scientific way of looking at the world, and applying that to society. And there's a couple of things that come from that. One is the questioning of basic assumptions. So good science, kind of tries to start from a neutral stance and observe the world as it is. And so this way of thinking would challenge existing traditions like monarchies. You should know, though, that some of these people were monarchists. So it's not like anti-monarchy. It just kind of opens up that distinction. So John Locke, for instance, wrote his social contract in order to justify removing one king, but then replacing that king with another. Voltaire wrote letters to absolutists like Catherine the Great. He went and lived with Frederick the Great in Prussia, who didn't even free his own serfs, and was definitely an absolute monarch. So it's not that these things lead directly to democracy, but they do open up questioning, and they do set up a philosophical basis for challenging existing traditions. And then finally, they produce a style of writing where things can be justified logically as opposed to just with tradition, and that's going to lead to famous Enlightenment writings like the American Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and other adaptations. Okay, I'm going to open a poll here to see. Which of these three would you feel like it would be best for you to know about? A question about that timeline there, I would say the Enlightenment and the Agricultural Revolution are happening at the same time, and they're both going to overlap with the early Industrial Revolution as it happens this would happen in European history. So you can think of both the Enlightenment and the Agricultural Revolution as things that happened in the 18th century, the 1700s. Okay. Hope we got some votes coming in. Thank you. Keep it coming. There we go. Ooh, there is a clear trend emerging. It's all right. You can, some of the things I'm doing are maybe beyond what's happening, and you have plenty of time to review. Whatever you've learned, David, you can use. So if some of the things I'm saying are not things that you've done, that's okay. But what you want to do is, can you attach things you do know to some of these things? Because no one's going to know everything. If my students were to sit in your teacher's class, they would learn something that I hadn't said, because world history is huge. Okay? So just kind of keep making some connections here. All right, there is clear preference here. So we have a certain amount of time. I will spend my talking time on the Latin American Wars of Independence, and you all can keep in the after party whatever questions you have about the other things. Is that question for me and Natalie? Yeah, so just kind of keep connecting things, David and Marissa. I think a little bit each day is good. If you take a look at the slides that Melissa and I do, and there's that big idea slide with the black background and the white letters, and the power vocab, if you can connect your own examples to those, that's a good thing. Yeah, at this point, I haven't even started after school review with my students yet, although we'll probably start that in a week. So, if you're just doing these things and then looking back through your notes, if you have notes, the most powerful note-taking strategy or studying strategy is to take your own notes. So if you have class notes and you go back and look at them now after doing a stream like this, and you highlight some things, yeah, and you highlight some things in your own notes that popped out from this, like, I mean, spending like maybe 15 minutes and just talking about it. The thing with Discord is our brains are wired to be social. And so if you're talking about it with other students, that's great. So, now that might be a problem. But depending, I don't know, it depends on what kind of schedule you're on. I wouldn't even want to say that. But you do need to get through all the units. So, but we'll keep going. You just keep tuning in, Em. We'll be good. All right. So here we are with the 4 revolutions that come up. And I have these images here. You can see if you can guess which one goes with which revolution. It might be a fun little activity to do. And I have 2 that show declarations or congresses or lawyering. And so one's a congress and one's a declaration, people meeting together. And I have 2 that show crowd violence. You'll be fine, self-study. You just keep coming, Pep. All right. So we see that all of these revolutions involve both declarations, like legal challenges and changes, and crowd violence of different kinds. So we'll see that. And so does anyone know which revolutions we have here? Yeah, I'm with Natalie about finishing the course. It all depends on like how long. Some people, if you started in January, you might be halfway right now. So you look at the revolutions here. We have the American Revolution in the top right. From a British perspective, can anyone guess what events are being shown here? The top right. The bottom left shows the French Revolution, the crowd violence in Paris. And the top left is the Haitian Declaration of Independence. And then the bottom right is the, top right, there we are. Yep, Bastille, that's right, or Bastille. You've got that. And then it's the one of the Congresses, that's Simon Bolivar there. All right. So that is part of what is happening. So with each of these, now the American and Haitian and Latin Wars of independence all produced new countries. With France, they went through a couple of constitutions, and there's some changes, and it produced some enduring ideas. But the most important thing with the American, Haitian, and Latin American Wars of Independence, they produced new countries, right? Well, they're forcing him to like drink tar, putting tar on him, getting tartan feather. Yeah, Boston Tea Party. Again, this is a British perspective. You can see how they're shown as evil. Right? Okay. This is another part of the context that doesn't affect industrialization as much, but it's just a reminder that that there had been rebellions against slavery. Like the Haitian Revolution, as you might know, was a slave rebellion in part. It became a massive slave rebellion, the world's largest successful slave rebellion that produced the first country to outlaw slavery, Haiti. And that was part of a tradition of slave rebellion and marronage. I spelled it maroonage there, but I think it's that you would want. So a maroon, remember, is it was somebody who'd escaped slavery or a descendant of somebody in a community that was freed from slavery, like that. I think you should look for key concepts. Qiaojing. I would recommend those, big ideas like we put at the beginning of these, and then highlight your notes for those. And then, yes, think about how they relate to each other. That was the American Revolution because they were pouring tea down that guy, or not tea, tar, because they tarred and feathered tax collectors. Okay. Now, there are 3 documents that are named in the course and exam description. That meaning they're not illustrative examples, they're named right in there. So they're things that could definitely come up in the on the AP test. So the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which is in the middle, the Declaration of the Rights of Man Citizen, which is on the right, and then some Jamaica letter. And what the Jamaica letter means is it was something that was written by Bolivar, who's an important person. So you might know his name. It looks like Simon. And I don't know how to put the accent in here in the chat, but Simon Bolivar, who was one of the leaders of the Latin American independence movements. And this is to get to the question. And in that, he was in Jamaica, which was a British colony, because he was a revolutionary, an independence fighter in the Spanish colony. So he was hiding out in Jamaica. He also hid out in Haiti for a while, or took shelter. I think it was public. And he wrote this letter. And apparently there was backstory, because the letter basically starts, "You ask me why we want independence," meaning the Spanish colonists. And he's like, "I am going to tell you." And so then he lays it out, and he makes a few points. And so this might get at some of your questions about the Latin American wars of independence. So in Latin American society, that's the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, society was structured by race and class, which is also true of the Anglo-American, like British North American colony, but in a way that was similar and different to the North American situation. And so Bolivar was what's known as a Creole, or a Criollo in Spanish, meaning he was of Spanish ancestry. He would have been racially white, but from the American. And people in that situation did not have access to the highest colonial positions. They also faced those restrictions. Like I was saying, like with the tobacco factory, there were restrictions on what they could buy and sell, who they could buy it from the British or the Dutch, because they were cheap, had to buy them from Spanish merchants. And so one of the things he lays out in that letter is that people wanted to be treated, and they wanted to be free. He also lays out a kind of nationalism, using the word American. Yes. So, yes, that's right. The Jamaica letter was a statement. It's not a declaration. It's literally a letter. But it was a public letter, like it was meant to be read. He's like, "Dear friend, you asked to be independent. Here's why. We want to be independent because the Spanish restrict us in ways that are unfair, and we don't like it. And when we should be free." So it enunciates some of these kind of Enlightenment-related ideas. It also contains the idea that Americans are different from Spaniards, even if they're even like Spanish Americans, like Bolivar, who are descended from Spaniards, that they're different, that a difference has arisen. So you can think of that as a kind of nationalism. Yeah, right. Now later, there are going to be other declarations that those countries become independent in the 1820s, and so there will be other declarations, but this would be the most famous one. Yeah, that's right, Lynn. He was thinking of the Americas, like Spanish Americas, like from Argentina all the way north through Mexico, as potentially one large country. And in fact, what's today Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador were one country for a while, and then they broke apart. Right. So there's also here, this connects to the other revolutions in another way. In the wars that followed the French Revolution, leader was Napoleon. And Napoleon invaded Spain, and he removed the French army under Napoleon, invaded Spain, removed the French king, and Napoleon made his brother king. Now, the whole situation is pretty complicated, but for your purposes, just know that created chaos politically. Because in the Spanish colonies, you have like the old king, you have the new king. There's people in Spain who decided not to follow either king and decided to write a new constitution. You don't have to know the deep details on that, but just know that the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon upset Spanish control of the Americas, and many Spaniards wanted, or many Spanish Americans, Creoles, were interested in independence. But there were also a lot of other people who wanted more rights, so people of color, pardos, like free people of African ancestry, and formerly enslaved people, or mestizo people, And so there was a lot of social revolution that happened too. And in the Latin American countries, unlike the American Revolution, or much more so than the North, just in the American Revolution, slavery was abolished in these places after the Wars of Independence. So there was more of a social revolution happening there as well. All right. I am going to move ahead here. Well, let's go through these pretty quickly. These revolutions then created new ideologies. You don't have to know tons about these. And they're also going to relate to the Industrial Revolution. Liberalism is basically the ideas of the French Revolution, and conservatism was original. So it doesn't really mean like what we would use these words today to mean in American politics. Because a lot of people who are Republicans, for instance, in the United States, consider themselves classical liberals, right? They'll use that. People use that phrase. Not all, but some. Conservatism was opposition to the French Revolution. Yes. Xiao Jing, yes, I would agree with that assessment. That's a real nice way to summarize it. Looks like it's part of my spoken. Correct. And then nationalism came out of these when the new countries were created. Later, these ideas that came out of these revolutions were then applied to other situations right at the same time. So a big example of that, these are two documents that were produced arguing for rights for women, what we would call feminism, happened at the same time as the French Revolution. So Mary Wollstonecraft, wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And it's a defense, like using the idea of the French Revolution and liberalism and greater freedoms to argue, well, that we should apply this also to gender, not just class. And then the same thing is the Declaration of Rights of Woman and the female citizen, or citizen with the female suffix on it, in French by Alain de Gouges. And this was a statement of exactly what it sounds like, right? The Declaration of the Right, they mimic the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and then sort of the word woman in there as a way to talk about that. So if this is another one of the products. All right. Now, I find that students often know the most about industrialization of any topic that we cover. So what I'm going to go through here in the last few minutes are what you really need to know in order to use this in a world history context. And then you can keep asking questions, and the after party is going to be hopping, as I understand it. The first thing I would say is it's useful to think of the Industrial Revolution as being kind of having two phases, or sort of two industrial revolutions. The first one relates to iron production, increasing, steam engine, and textiles. And we can think of this as centered in Britain. That's an interesting thing because the technical requirements to happen could have happened in Japan or in China, in parts of India, but for other reasons, which I think is still debatable, but probably has to do with capitalism and colonies, it happens in England. So the first one is centered on these products, and then if you take iron and steam, that's going to lead to railroads. And then the second industrial revolution, which will start in the 1850s, is where you start to get these much bigger cities, larger urban areas. And so the big thing, if you look in the top right there, that's a Bessemer converter. And that mass production of steel, which was a huge industry all by itself, but also made railroad expansion and skyscrapers and more factories. It was like the raw material of this time period, steamships. The mass production of steel had this huge enabling effect for other changes. So that second industrial revolution is really important context for what Melissa's going to talk about on Saturday, which is imperialism. already looked at this a little bit. The picture on the right, the picture on the bottom left, those are women and they're typing. Okay. Right, maybe, and just saying, is it Britain, the way that it relates to the Napoleonic Wars? That's maybe like why Britain as opposed to, say, France. It doesn't totally help us understand like why Britain as opposed to, say, southeastern China. But yeah, no, there's a lot of things. All these things are contingent. History will come out different ways if other things hadn't happened. So you can think of the first industrial revolution as 1770s. People are going to debate that, but certainly like the end of the 1700s, early 1800s. Capitalism is going to create new social classes where capitalists are investors, people who are investing money. So they're wealthy because of their investments, not necessarily, they might have inherited money that they're investing, but not necessarily because of their, it could be on, they're not nobles. The whole point is they're not nobles, although some nobles became capitalists, but capitalists are factory owners, right? The second industrial revolution will be happening in Britain and Western Europe and the United States, and then later in Japan, kind of same places. Okay. The idea of middle classes then will emerge of people, and new gender ideas will come out of this. So the women here in this picture wouldn't have been part of separate spheres because they're out in the workplace, but this is a way that modernity will actually marginalize women. But in their separate spheres, sometimes women will organize women's rights clubs, and so then it'll, swing back the other way. So the idea of middle classes are people who make a salary. They're not investors, they're not nobles, but they're also not laborers. So the people here would be, either in the top right, would be part of the working class, because those women are working for wages, getting paid by the hour, and they're controlled. The working classes are controlled, right? It was the ideal for the middle classes in European and American industrial societies that women not work for wages or salary outside the house. Managing a household would have been a lot of work, but in terms of paid labor in the market, no. And as time went on, wealthy is not the right word, but better paid working class families also aspired to this. One of the social effects from this will be these classes then. These are new classes of people. So one thing that's useful to understand is the difference between the working class and the and peasants. Like, peasants means people who are producing food, agriculturalists who are mostly producing things for subsistence with some extra to be traded on a market or sold to buy other things. Whereas wage laborers don't have anything. They don't make wage laborers. What working class means is they're making wages and they're not making anything that they get to keep at the end of the day. So a peasant is going to make some things that they get to keep, and then they're going to sell some of the other stuff. And they might have to give some of what they make to a noble. But some of what they make, like grow food or, vegetable garden or making something, they're going to keep those things. Okay. So we have that. So the growth of this working class then is going to lead to different kinds of conflict. And that conflict could take the form of collective bargaining, like these railroad engineers here from Australia, who are forming into an association to try to get better wages and conditions. It could lead to governments advocating for reforms like maximum hours laws or child labor laws, or in Britain there was laws that restricted the number of hours that women could work, things like that. And then other revolutionary ideas like communism will come into play here, and that's a communist postcard on the right that shows all the workers around the world coming together to create a new society. So these new social classes will influence politics and culture. The other big effect is, if you take a look at this chart, and if you're watching the replay, you can pause and look at it. But if you see on the left, the blue and the green, is China, the rest of East Asia, and India. And that is more than half of world manufacturing in 1750, even in 1800. But if you notice what's happening with the United Kingdom up at the top as the Industrial Revolution progresses. So one of the mega trends here is that the 1800s are the European century, when the Industrial Revolution alters the global balance of power in favor of Europe. So a lot of things, like in my last stream, one of the things I said is you have to delay when you announce European dominance in world history. Well, 1800s when you can stop delaying that. Dominance is probably still too strong for the whole globe, but as the most powerful region. So you can see what happens. And then you can see how it changes. And then China's growing back again when we get to 2016. The one exception to that, of course, is the Meiji Restoration in Japan, which again has a lot of continuity in it because Japan was manufacturing things, but they also invited in experts and learned from other places and continued their own traditional industries and then industrialized. There's a lot of great pictures that show this. And so here we see a Japanese scene with a steamship in it and a railroad bridge. And people, and you might see in the crowd, there's still a lot of traditional attire. So not everyone changes everything about what's happening. So there's continuity and change. When we get to the next stream, then up here for Melissa to take a look at next time. So these are things, because Japan will become one of the imperialist countries that is part of the age, the new imperialism of the late 1800s and early 1900s. So I will share this with her. And if you have any other questions, you can go ahead and ask in the chat before we go. And then, of course, the after party will be popping, as the kids say. And you can ask any other questions there. So it's been fun. Thank you for the active chat and everything. Please do go down at the bottom there and vote, because I will share this, because I know many of you will be back on Saturday in the afternoon. So that's economic imperialism, resistance to imperialism, rationales for imperialism, and global migration. Those are 4 of the important topics in Unit 6. Well, you are welcome. Bye-bye. Thank you for coming. You don't need to know many battles, key terms. It would be good to know like a person or two, maybe a battle, but the way you're going to use this, you're not going to go like on a battle by battle basis for how it came out. You're going to use a person or an event or a battle as an evidence to illustrate a bigger theme. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. It's very nice. Oh, Gabby, don't worry. Natalie will pick you up on that. That's very kind of you, Lynn. I appreciate that. Even if the Google machine is giving your name an unwarranted N. Good. All right, I'm just leaving this open. People are voting. I feel like the voting has stopped, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and wave it out goodbye. And if you've left already, that's fine. A little bit of a lag there. All right. Have a good night, everyone. Happy studying. You've got this. There's a lot of time left.